Now I need to add the HTTP post form of the index action method, to which MVC will automatically pass the values of the report and render format selections that the user makes. The result value returned by a successful call to the render method is an array of bytes, so I'm going to need to either save it to disk or render it correctly in the browser. And so what I'm going to do in this code is the latter approach, to actually display it in the browser and let the user download any other files like an Excel file, Word file, XML file, and so forth directly through the browser. But you have lots of other options in how you can handle that render result. All right, so here's my initial index action method. Notice that it doesn't take any parameters. It doesn't have an attribute. I could include an HTTP GET attribute if I wanted to on this index action method, but it's the default, so it's not necessarily. It's commonly not done. And so I'll come down here, and I need to add a new method. First thing I'll do is add that HTTP post attribute, and then I'll define the method as a public method. I'm going to return an action result. Although, as you'll see, not all paths through the code actually return an action result, but I cover that. I need to name it the same thing, so it'll be called index. Now here's where it really gets interesting. Nice thing about MVC is that if I include parameters to this method that are named the same as the controls on the web page, MVC will automatically populate those variables, those input parameters to this method, with the values that the user selected. All right, so I want to get the name of the report that the user selected. So I'm going to use a variable with the same name as that element that I defined within the view. I want to get the format, again, the same name as that drop-down list box. And then I also need to get the name or the value of the submit button that the user clicked. So I'm going to include a third item here for submit. Recall in the view I named that button submit, actually both of them submit, and then I can use the value of that submit parameter, in this case through this submit variable, in order to see which button the user clicked. Really makes it pretty slick. Okay, so that's the skeleton of my action method, and so now I can start adding code to it. So the first thing I need to do is, similar to the other action method, is I need to set up the object that gives me access to the web service. But this time it needs to be the execution service. So this time I'm going to use msexec, and specifically that report execution service, which is the top level object, the entree into that web service. Okay, I'm going to name that RS for reporting services and new up that same object. Okay, so now that instantiates that object, and I have a connection to the reporting services report server. I again need to provide credentials, so I'm going to use that object and the credentials object of it, and once again access that system.net.credentialcache.default credentials, and that'll again pass in my Windows credentials, which I'm authorized on that report server with. Okay, once again I need to extract the application settings. So I'm going to copy this code, even though I need to modify it just a little bit, and bring it down here. Save typing it. But instead of using a report view model, from this action method I don't need to provide the view with any more information. I'm just going to render the report. So instead I'm going to save this as a string parameter called report server, and do the same thing here and name them the same as the properties, but the lowercase leading character. Okay, again, that's going to grab those settings from the web.config file. And you can do that other ways. You can retrieve them from a database. You can get them in various ways, whatever makes sense for the application. By the way, I have a red squiggly under this index, and if I hover over it, it's because I don't have a return statement yet. So not all code paths return a value. We're going to deal with that. It's not because I have an overloaded method. It has nothing to do with that, because I have different parameters coming into this method. So that's just fine. All right, for the code now, I have a little bit more work than I had with the management service to set up the execution service to retrieve a report and execute it. I just need to get some additional information from it that is required to execute the report. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use that rsexec service and grab the execution info. And I'm going to save that in a variable called execinfo. And I'll new up that object. And now I have access to that execution information. The other thing I need to do for setup, and I'll use that execinfo a little bit later. The other thing I need to do is set the execution header. So I'm going to again use that rsexec, access the execution header, and name it execHeader, and new up that object. And then I need to use that to set the execution header value. And there's various things in that header that I can modify and so forth, but I'm not going to worry about those right now. So I'm going to access now that web service through the RS and set the execution header value property to that exec header. Now this shows that the web service is stateful. So I'm setting properties of it that I'm then going to later use within a method. In a stateless API, I would be doing everything, all setup, setting any properties and everything, in a single method. Okay, so you can see that this web service really isn't designed to contemporary standards for the most part. And I suspect that's why we have to create a web reference rather than a service within the application. Okay, so just a little bit of bookkeeping, have to include that stuff and just go with it. Next, we need to load the report. And that is going to provide us with some information about the report that we need in order to execute it. Now, the load report method requires two parameters. One is a report path. We have to tell it which report we want to use and where it's located on the server. Okay, that's fine. But then there's a second required parameter called history. And I'm going to pass in a null string for that parameter because we're not going to use anything to do with the report history in this particular case. So I first need to define that history ID. Set it equal to a null because we're not actually going to use it, but we need to pass it. And here is where I set the value of that execinfo variable that I created a couple lines ago. And I'm going to then call on the web service the load report method and pass in the report path. Oh, I didn't do one thing. So I'll go ahead and set that. I need to define that variable. And then also pass in that history ID. All right, I blew past this a little bit too fast, so I need to do one other thing here. I need to create that report path variable. So this is going to take the report folder and tack onto it the name of the report. So it's a string, it's report path. And so for that, I'm going to use the report folder, concatenate on / for the path, and then concatenate on the report. So this is the benefit of MVC, where this report variable, because I named it again the same as the control on the page, is going to be populated with the report that the user selected. And so that's all I need to do in order to build that report path and then pass it to that load report method call. Okay, so that's my overall setup for executing the report. Still need to do a few things, such as, execute the report. But this is where the paths between the two buttons diverge. So I'm going to include an if statement here, and I'm going to check the value of that submit button. Strictly speaking, I'm checking the value of the submit parameter that, because I named it the same as those two buttons, is going to receive the value of that button. And so I can compare that to the value of the button, which is what the button displays to the user. So in the first instance, I'm going to do a view report by custom URL. And then I'm going to have some code there. And then I'm going to do an else if. Check that value again. And in this case, view the report by web service. Okay, so there are my two different paths that I'm going to take through here. Real application, you're probably not going to have both of these, but I want to demonstrate both techniques so that you can compare the code that's required to build a custom URL, but using characteristics of the report to build the URL versus directly calling the web service. And so the first one that I'm going to implement is calling the report by a web service. So this code that I'm going to write here is going to use the fruits of the setup code in the first part of the action method in order to call this code. All right, first thing I need to do is, well, I'm going to be using the render method in order to actually render the report, bring it down as an array of bytes. But that method, as you'll see, has a couple of required input parameters and then several output parameters. So I need, some of those I've already defined, but I also need to define the other parameters. All right, so I'm going to create these. Most of them are strings. Set that to null. This is device information. There's an extension. There's an output parameter. There's a MIME type. And as you're going to see, I'm actually going to use that MIME type in how I render it out to the browser, the final report. There's an encoding string that is returned. And then there's also a set of warning messages if they apply. So I need to use the rsexec warning object. I'm going to get an array of those back, and I'll call those warnings. And I'll set that array equal to null. All right, so there's a variable. If I get any warnings, I'll get them back from the render method by that, and then I can look at that collection and then display them to users, do something in response, whatever's appropriate. In the sample application, I'm not going to do anything with them, but in a real application, you should pay attention to those. Okay, then I also need an array variable of stream IDs. Set that equal to null. And that also I'm not going to use within this application. And then I need to define a byte array that is going to hold the result, which is actually going to hold the report itself. And I'll set that to null. Okay, so those are all the additional variables that I need. I have those green squigglies, and if I hover over it, it just means that I'm creating the variable, declaring the variable, but I'm never using it. Well, I'm going to fix that right now. All right, so I'm going to use the result and call that rs render method. And I'll pass in the format. And this is the format that the user selected. So that's coming in from this format variable right there. I'll pass in the dev info. And then I have several output parameters, as you can see down below here in the little tooltip that I'm getting. Okay, so I'm going to do out extension, out MIME type, out encoding, out warnings, and out stream IDs. I'll break this up. Okay, so there's the code that actually renders the report. Once that line executes, result now has an array of bytes of the report in whatever format I've requested. PDF, Excel, Word, whatever the user has requested. Okay, so at this point, I now need to do something with that report. Options include saving it to a file. If this were a desktop application and I was accessing the web service, I might save it out to a file. Here, in a browser application, I'm going to let the browser handle it. So I'm going to render the report. I'm going to use the information that I've collected so far, including the result, which is the report. And build some HTML headers to output it to the browser. So if the report is HTML, it'll just render in the browser, and we're done. If it's a file-based format that a browser can't display, then the browser will give the option of opening it in the default application on the machine or saving it someplace, just like browsers do. When you click on a link that downloads a .xml file, it'll either display it if the browser can, or download it, or open it in a default application. Interestingly, if the browser has an extension built into it, or that's something a third-party thing that you've added, you can support displaying it within the browser, even if it's not HTML. All right, deal with that more later. Okay, so let's add that code. In order to do this, I'm going to use the response object of this ASP.NET application to build some headers. You actually use some methods in order to build some headers, and then output the data. All right, so I'm going to use the response, and I'll use this several times. Response, I'm going to start by clearing the content, so it clears out anything else that I accidentally wrote out to the page. And then I'm going to append a header. And specify the content length. So now I'm in the language here of HTML, actually HTTP, to specify the content length. And I'm going to use the size of that result, use the length property of it, convert it to a string, and that specifies that size. So now the browser knows how much data to expect and what needs to render. It's a very simple thing to do. Okay, so response once again, I'm going to specify the content type. And here's where I use the MIME type that was the variable that was returned. This information is returned by the render method. So I'm not directly using the format information, but this is going to be a string like text/XML or text/HTML or wherever's appropriate for that format type. All right, so it's really nice that the render method returns that, so I don't have to have some sort of a switch statement that figures out that, okay, the user requested XML, so it needs to be text XML or things like that. I just use the MIME type that was returned by the render method. Okay, so I've set everything up, and now it's time to actually write out the report itself. So I'm going to use binary write to do that and pass in that result variable. So binary write, it's cool that response understands how to do that. I don't need to do any other manipulations of that array of bytes. By using binary write, it just treats those as an array of bytes, and I'm done. Okay? All right, then a couple cleanup things. I need to use the response and flush it. That tells it to actually write it out to the browser and have the browser display it. And then also close that stream. Okay, so again, that is what is going to display the report in the browser. HTML will display it. Any of the formats that has an extension for it or supports, it'll display it. Otherwise, it'll ask the user if they want to open it in the default Windows application or save it to disk. All right, one last thing I need to do is I've not supplied any return value yet. And remember, that's why I have this syntactical error right there. Because I have an action method, I've specified that I'm going to return an action result. But this particular code path doesn't have an action method that I need to return. Little looking ahead, this code path is going to. So that's why I used action result as a return of this method instead of void. But all code paths have to return a result. It has to be an action method. Fortunately, MVC has this really nice empty result that it can return. So I'm going to new up an empty result. So that's instantiating this new object, essentially tells it that I'm done, render the result. And showing me syntactical errors, it would be helpful to have, no, I don't need an equal sign. Save it. Oops, I put it outside the method. Need it right here. That's why it was giving me the squiggly because I was trying to return from nothing, just sort of outside the definition of, I guess, returning from the class, strictly speaking. So that's why I was getting the squiggly. Okay, so with any kind of luck, I've done everything correctly. You can look up here, scan through, no more red squigglies. That's always a promising sign. We already have everything in the index view in order to do this. So let's go ahead and give it a whirl. Page displays, that's always a very good sign. This button still does nothing. Just goes out to the same page and re-renders everything. And there you can see the result of using that empty result as the default result value. Because that code path didn't provide any information, didn't specify a view, it didn't do anything, I got that default return value that I put in at the very bottom of that action method, and this is the empty result. That's what I got. Okay, so now what I need to do instead is reload this. It should go back, and actually it may, actually need to go back to this page. And now I'll click on this button, which actually has some code and does something with it. So it's going to look at the category sales by year in the web format. So I'm going to stick with HTML for the moment. So I'll click on that, goes out to reporting services, and does nothing. It's not even whirling. Let me try running this again. I may have confused it a bit. Okay, so it'll go out, generate the page one more time. I won't do that side trip into clicking the button that doesn't have any code. Go over here. Okay, I have done something wrong. Let's take a look at this code. All right, so viewing the report by web service. Let me put a breakpoint in here to make absolutely sure. Right, web service. Maybe in the index method I did something wrong. I mean, in index view I might have misspelled something. I seem to be having a problem with that today. Click on that. And it's not hitting that breakpoint. Okay. That suggests to me, view report by web service. That looks like that's properly spelled. Let's open up that index. Go down here. View report by web service. And there I see what the problem is. MVC is actually using the name value of the element. And I only put in the ID. Let's fix that. It's sort of annoying that all too often, particularly in ASP.NET, you have to include both the name and the ID value, but be that as it may. Okay, so it has both name, I spelled it right, this looks like it's spelled right. Let's try it again. Going out, once again, getting the list of reports, and click on that. Now it goes out. It's thinking a little bit longer. That's promising. This is flashing. So it hit that breakpoint. Okay. I'm going to remove that breakpoint and go ahead and continue. And it'll come out and it should display the report. And there it is. All right, so we have the report and the user can view it. And notice that we're not using a report manager URL. We're not using a custom URL into the report. We're displaying the report by directly accessing the web service and then using those bytes that are returned in order to display the report. And in this case, it's HTML, and so it renders it directly on the web page. Okay, so let's explore a couple other reports. So let's look at company orders, just as another report. This is a little bit more typical report, grouped report. Notice that it's all implemented as essentially a single web page because the entire report is downloaded. So there's not this concept of breaking it up into pages, although you can see that there are page breaks because the HTML 4.0 renderer is a soft page break renderer. And you can scroll over and the report's a little wide for my resolution here, but you can see you get a fairly typical report. Now let's look at the drill down report. This one's kind of interesting. So I'm still sticking with HTML4. Notice that I get the report very quickly. It has a lot of data in it, but it rendered very quickly. Notice the URL, localhost. This is just I happen to be using the the built-in IIS Express with Visual Studio, so that's a random port number that's used. So if you try this at home, it'll probably be a different port number. And then home and index for that action method. Now I want to view this report. I can click on it in various places. I'm just clicking through the report, nothing happens. Now I want to drill down into it. Notice that what happens is that I'm actually making a call to the server, which isn't terribly surprising, but then I got redirected to this live version of the report using this report viewer form of the custom URL technique of accessing reports. It's not using Report Manager, but it's directly going in and accessing the reports. So it redisplays the report, gives me the HTML viewer, and then now I can drill down into it because I'm actually looking at the live report. All of this data was not contained within those bytes that were rendered as part of the report. So this is kind of a weirdness of drill down reports. So just be aware of that. If you display drill down reports to users, they still may get to the server to access the report directly if they drill down into the data. Okay, maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing, whatever works for your application. All right, let's look at another report. This is a real fun one. So this is product sales ad hoc. I'll click on this, and kablooey, we get an exception. All right, so this is an exception of type blah, 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 SOAP extension. Additional information. This report requires a default or user-defined value for the report parameter begin date. To run or subscribe to this report, you must provide a parameter. Well, which kind of makes sense. I haven't done anything with parameters yet. This report requires two parameters, begin date and end date, for the beginning and ending date of the range of sales data that you want to view. And I did nothing to provide those values. This is an exception, an unhandled exception within the application. So in the render method, you can see the exception was raised in this render method. It couldn't handle, it actually got a SOAP exception back, and that's what we're seeing. It couldn't handle the request because I didn't provide all the information that we needed for that particular report. So we need to provide parameters. I'm not going to talk about that now. That's for another step in the development of this application. All right, I'm going to do continue and come back over here, and here's the yellow screen of death, as it's affectionately known within the ASP.NET world, and it gives me that same exception information. I'm running this from within Visual Studio, so I got that exception within the code. But this is what a user would see, assuming that you have custom errors turned off. Okay, lots of good information, and here is the information where it says, parameters not set, and it specifically says begin date. So I need to provide a parameter for begin date. Okay, I'll go over here, and there's actually 3 reports that require parameters. Product sales ad hoc, product sales unbound, and the products by category multi-value. So just be aware that those are reports that have required parameters. Okay, so let's go back over to this report here and just look at a couple of the formats. So I'll select the PDF format. So that, remember, that's that pretty blue chart that displays all kinds of sales by year. Display that. Now, interestingly, this renders within the browser because I have the Foxit Reader installed on this machine, and that installs an extension to Internet Explorer that will display PDF files directly within the browser. And so it's displayed. This is a PDF file. If there are bookmarks, I could look at bookmarks, do all the different things that you can do with PDF files, print it, whatever. Now, interestingly, there seems to be a bug either in Internet Explorer or the Foxit extension, I don't know which. Notice I don't have a valid back button anymore. I only have a forward button, and I can go forward there, and the web page is expired. So there's something going on behind the scenes. I should be able to reload things and get back to my page, but so there's something going on with the back button. So some weirdness. All right, now I'm going to look at that same report, not PDF, but one of the file formats that I'm not going to open up directly. Export it to Excel. It'll generate a .xslx file, and I have the option here of opening the file, saving it, or saving as. By default, if I save, it'll go to my downloads file, but I'll select Save As, and I have this C junk folder, and there I have just this default name. I didn't do anything to give it a name, and the XLSX. And I'll save that, and now we have this Excel file. And if I open it up, it'll open up that file in Excel. I have Excel. I can do this because I have Excel installed on this machine. And now I have this as a file, as an Excel worksheet. Okay, so all of these options work as you'd expect otherwise because of how we used those bytes of data that was returned by the render method.